Welcome to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. This episode is part of our Indies Introduced series, where we spotlight debut authors handpicked by booksellers from around the country. In each episode, a bookseller from the Indies Introduced panel will interview the author of a debut title featured in our program.
Hi, I am Austen Carter. I am an owner and operator of Pocket Bookshop in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, and I'm here to chat with Alice Austen, the author of a fabulous new novel called 33, Place Brugmann. I loved reading this book, although in revisiting it, I realized how scary and prescient it is to be reading at this particular moment, which I think we will get into. But before I even jump in with your bio, Alice, would you like to give your elevator pitch of what the novel is? You're probably far better at that than I am.
Well, I don't know. I have a good friend who won the Commonwealth Book Prize for Africa, and he was interviewed on the BBC, and they said, "What's your book about?" And he told me this by way of saying, "Always prepare," because he hadn't prepared his blurb for what his book was about. So I do have an elevator pitch. It is the book opens in 1939 in a building in Brussels, and the address is 33 Place Brugmann, and it follows the residents of this Beaux-Arts building during the occupation and through Europe, and it follows their lives, their struggles, and their interactions. And I'm told it's suspenseful.
It is. No, I feel like that's exactly right. It's both suspenseful and it feels expansive and yet cozy. Sort of. Cozy is maybe not quite the right word, but it's something. It's intimate.
At times, there's coziness to it.
Yeah. Intimate is probably the better word. Yes, that is a perfect summary. Tell your friend you did a great job. So we'll back up now and do your bio so that our listeners know a little bit more about who it is that they're listening to. So Alice Austen won the John Cassavetes Award for her debut film, Give Me Liberty, as writer-producer. She's a past resident of the Royal Court Theatre, and her internationally produced plays include Animal Farm at Steppenwolf Theatre, Water, Cherry Orchard Massacre, and Girls in the Boat at Dramatic Publishing. She studied creative writing under Seamus Heaney at Harvard, where she received her JD, after which she moved to Brussels and lived on Place Brugmann. Austen currently lives in Milwaukee and is working on a new film and her next novel. And so I am going to jump in with what I hope isn't a trite question / one that maybe because you're at the beginning of your publicity tour, you haven't had to answer a million times yet, which is though 33 Place Brugmann is your debut novel, you are normally in a different realm of media. You're a filmmaker and playwright, which is not at all surprising considering how cinematic the novel is, both in scope and structure. So I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about your transition from stage to page, as it were, and how your filmmaking experience affects your writing.
It's a great question. And thank you for your very kind words about the book. It is honestly such a pleasure to be here. And to me, it's enormously exciting that booksellers have gotten behind 33. It's just a complete thrill. So to your question, I began as a writer of fiction. And I continued to write fiction as these other paths opened up to me. I wrote my first play on a pub bet, and it was produced. And I went on to become a Chicago playwright, but I never studied theater. And as a playwright, I really had to learn a lot on the fly about dramatic structure, how to build tension and suspense, how to keep an audience engaged. It was really fun. Theater is so alive. Everything happens in the moment. Things go wrong in the course of a performance that have to be righted. Actors pull crazy pranks on one another. I have so many wonderful colleagues from theater. Film, in particular screenwriting, to me is the bridge between theater and novelistic writing. While theater is all about telling a story with these extraordinary constraints, film gives you the sort of big canvas that you have as a novelist. But there are also constraints in film, and writing screenplays is a very precise métier. What is the camera seeing? What are the different characters seeing? When does the action build? What triggers the action in the first place? How do you keep the third act from sagging? I've also produced films, and the work of a creative producer, which I think is one of the hardest and most underappreciated jobs in the business, is in its own way novelistic because you have to keep track of a lot of stories, a lot of details, both within the narrative of the film and also outside it in the production, the crew, the drama going on between crew and actors, and there are just so many details. So all of this has deeply informed my fiction writing.
I mean, okay, that's a really good answer. I'm like, okay, I need to step myself up. You're really good. Okay. I love to hear this. I love thinking about film as a bridge between theater and literary fiction. That's so smart in so many ways. That was not me being very articulate, but it's giving me a lot to think about, which is good. Can you talk a little bit about I want to talk about structure because that's kind of where you're thinking in terms of, how does a play work? How does a film work? How does a novel work? An important aspect of that, of course, is where are we putting this story? And so 33 largely takes place within the confines of the building. Um, Although we, like you say, we do kind of move around Europe. And so that setting can feel both expansive and claustrophobic. And community is such an important through line in the novel, but it ends up being a bit of a double-edged sword, right? The closeness of the building's tenants mean safety and there's aid nearby and they can rely on one another. But it also that also becomes very difficult when there's a lack of privacy and there's even potentially danger as tenants and their loyalties become unreadable to one another. So talk, if you will, a little bit about that closed-in setting and what it does for your novel.
Well, what I love is you've described 33 Plasberg, like the book, and you've also described the world.
Yeah.
So, so I lived in that building, and I knew I wanted to set the principal action of the novel there. I when I lived there, I learned stories. There were two elderly tenants or in the building who had lived there before, and in one instance during the occupation, and I heard their stories. And I'd gotten to know many people in Belgium and really was embedded there. I loved it. I lived there for years. And so I knew I wanted to write this and I knew I wanted to set it in the building. The idea became even more compelling to me after COVID and also on witnessing the political polarization that we see around the world today. People have such strong views. They don't entertain contradictory views, and yet often they live in communities where their neighbors, their
Mhm.
immediate neighbors, hold those contradictory views, right? So I imagine the world of the novel as it was for people in a close community holding different views and yet dependent on their neighbors for security, sometimes food.
Mhm.
I thought a great deal about the relationship between community, one's close, immediate environ, like your block, your building, your
Sure.
immediate neighborhood, and the larger political state. What if actions that make sense and seem moral in the one context don't and aren't in the other? This was more often than not the case in Belgium during the occupation. So how would we react? How did they react? And then there is that very important question of whom to trust and how you know for sure. And do you ever know for sure? It becomes a deadly game. So I was thinking of all of those things when I was writing the book.
Yeah, absolutely. And we, as the reader, get the benefit of being inside of everybody's head. So we get a little bit of a better sense of who to trust. But, not every character is going to tell us everything. They're definitely hiding and they're telling their stories in their own ways. And it's a novel with so many excellent characters. I at first, I feel like these novels that have so many perspectives are a bit of a challenge because at first you have to really keep a lot of things straight. And I appreciate that this novel, at least at the beginning, has the list of tenants. So I found myself flipping back and forth to be like, who lives in what apartment and what's their occupation and how are they related to these other people? But I, over the course of the novel, of course, grow fonder and fonder and fonder of each one. And I loved Masha. She's the Russian seamstress. Who had escaped to Brussels after the First World War. And there's so much to say about these people living in the shadow of the Great War, not knowing that they're about to be embroiled in another one. Um, this is an impossible question for you, but is there a perspective or character that you maybe hold a little bit dearer than the others, or is there one that you're kind of hoping readers will latch onto or get a little bit more out of than the others?
So I love this question. Well, first of all, I should predicate this with the fact that I did contemplate the structure of the novel a great deal, and I landed upon this idea of each character of having these multiple voices because what happens is you know what that character thinks and knows, and you know what other characters think and know that some characters don't know what the others know. And it was this way to create a verisimilitude of what people were going through at the time.
Mhm.
I think it makes it more, nerve-wracking, I suppose, for the reader. Apologies. But I have to say, I love all the characters, and you may doubt me, but I do. For one thing, the key for me to writing a character is to really get in their shoes, to see what they see, to feel their inner struggles, and to empathize with them, not to judge. If I were to judge my character's actions rather than to try and understand, even if they're what we might call evil, quote unquote, the
Sure.
character would inevitably become two-dimensional.
Yeah.
That said, there are characters who are closer to me and characters who, by the end of the writing process, drew closer still. I do love Masha. And I don't want to give any spoilers, but I love the characters who, as I wrote, surprised me with their complexity and moral compasses. And I hope they'll surprise the reader too.
Mm, I love that. Yes, I loved thinking about all of these readers relating to another. And there's so many times where I just wanted to jump in and be like, no, 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 you don't know, but this actually is happening over here. Or like, no, don't trust him. He actually has these kinds of loyalties, which is how you know you've hit on a really good book. That's always how I know. If I want to drop inside of the book, that's how I know it's one that I need to get in the hands of my readers as quickly as possible. Um, and I think now I'm moving toward a question that I don't even have an answer to, so don't feel bad if you're not sure where you want to go. But I was so obsessed with the character's obsession with a philosopher called Wittgenstein, who I read in graduate school, but I cannot say that I comprehended in graduate school. But a lot of these characters, or at least a kind of core trio of them, are turning to this his only, if I'm remembering right, his only book length work of philosophy called the Tractatus. Honestly, I don't
Yeah,
even know how you
I
pronounce
know.
it because nobody can pronounce it, nobody can read it, nobody understands it. But maybe you do. I'm really interested to know if you're the one who's cracked it. And but they're trying to make sense of an increasingly frightening world. Um, I loved Charlotte. She turns to the book kind of throughout the course of the novel because her father and his friend and the guy that she kind of loves and is kind of her brother and is kind of her neighbor and is all of these things is also obsessed with it. And so she tries and she just keeps reading it and being like, what am I supposed to be getting out of this? Is it comfort? Is it something, a sense of knowing? I'm not getting anything. Um, which is how I feel too when I try to read it. But if I'm parsing correctly, the idea of the philosophy here is it's like a call for precision in language, or at least an assertion that if there is a thing we cannot speak about precisely and clearly, it therefore doesn't have like an effect on our reality, or the only things that matter are the things we can speak about clearly, I guess, is what I think it is about. And that's like a very difficult line of thought. It's a challenge to add into a novel that's otherwise like very accessible. Um, so I'm wondering why Wittgenstein? What is the novel saying about language and understanding? Or we can like sidestep that and move into just what is the novel saying about this impulse that these characters have to turn to the written word, or at times they turn to art, they turn to music, they turn to I mean, hat making and seamstressing is an art in its way in the book. So like what are you end of the book saying about that impulse to turn to art and philosophy in times of cultural and societal uncertainty? No
So,
pressure.
no, no pressure. So my favorite quote about Wittgenstein is that no one understood him and then he changed his mind. So this book, Tractatus or Tractatus, or is and Leo, one of the characters, has this whole like, why didn't he just call it tract? Or, he's like goes on this sort of rant about the title, is a series of 525 statements
Mhm.
that Wittgenstein wrote during World War I when he was fighting for Germany in the trenches. It's a book I've long been fascinated with, and I pulled it out when I began to write 33. Interestingly, um, another book written by someone during combat and war is Catcher in the Rye. And I
Mhm.
think there's something that happens to a book when it's written in that moment. It becomes almost more than itself, the sum of it is more than the words in the page somehow. Anyway, so Wittgenstein was this brilliant mathematician and thinker, and he fought in this war that was caused in large measure by a failure to reach a common understanding among cousins, because all the
Mhm.
noble leaders
Sure.
in Europe at the time were cousins. His book, I think, in part, it's seeking to discover and articulate the relationship between language and reality, as you said, like how to find a common understanding, if not through philosophy, then through logic and deductive reasoning. Whether he does or not, let's leave that aside. I don't know that anyone could possibly really weigh in on that. But yes, I think he's trying to get at the idea of how we can know what's true or actual and communicate that to one another because it seemed so critical during World War I, and of course now in 1939, during, at the beginning of number 33, it's like incredibly important. So in particular, this is important in times of uncertainty, as you said, which brings us to his thoughts on how pictures might be the truest representation of the truth. And that becomes a jumping off point for the discussion of art in 33. So in 1939, when my novel opens, that devastating First War has given rise to World War II, and some believe that the boy who was Hitler's anti-Semitic obsession in Mein Kampf was actually Wittgenstein. They were the same age, and briefly they went to elementary school together, but Hitler was 2 years behind because Hitler was held back and Wittgenstein was moved ahead. So very interesting little backstory there. Um, so in 33, um, each character who engages with Wittgenstein with his book has a different reason for doing so. Like, as you said, Charlotte is trying to understand it because people around her are obsessed with it. And they
Mhm.
each have a very different reaction to it. So, for example, her father, Francois, an architect, contemplates how he and Wittgenstein, who fought against each other in the trenches, might, in other circumstances, well have been discussing ideas in architecture and philosophy. Wittgenstein himself was a sort of amateur architect, but designed a remarkable house for
Mhm.
his sister that's in Vienna. Um, so that they could have been doing that instead of shooting at each other. And Leo, an art collector and dealer, has no patience with the book. Except for him, it's too abstract, except for this one idea that ethics and aesthetics are the same. And
Mhm.
it's in that context that he talks about art and Nazis and how they're stealing the art because they can't make good art of their own. And of
Mhm.
course, then Julian is this mathematician, and he hears that there was a famous Wittgenstein Turing argument about the liar's paradox, which plays into
Mhm.
a lot of the book. So I don't know if that answered your question, but those are some of the pieces that were part of my considering the book in the context of the novel.
Absolutely. And I'm going to pretend that I knew all of that. And really, this was just my facetious way of getting you to explain to our listeners why Wittgenstein is important, and why you should maybe just read that wiki page if you get confused during the course of the novel. Or you can just identify with Charlotte and be like, okay, whatever these men are talking about.
Well, I love her take on like coming to philosophy cold and being like, I don't know if I really need this. And this is, these men who are trying to figure out a construct that explains the world. And it's very difficult to do that, if not impossible, because there's the mysticism in the world as well that she
Yeah.
acknowledges.
And yeah,
Go ahead.
and she fully understands that um well, she has a healthy skepticism, perhaps that this man in particular, or maybe any man, can quite understand how she sees the world, both because she is interestingly a colorblind character,
Yes.
and so she obviously is constantly thinking about how she literally perceives the world differently than other people, and also she's acutely aware of what it means to be a woman, and how that is coloring her sense of the world in ways that she's not totally convinced that I think Wittgenstein at least is considering.
No, I think that's right. And interestingly, there's this mysticism, I think, that's a thread throughout the book,
Mhm. Mhm.
but but Wittgenstein acknowledges it. And that's the other, like, you go through this incredible sort of, it's like become, in some measure, it's what modern logic, draws certainly from this as well. And formalistic, logical, thinking. And yet, at the end of the day, he's sort of acknowledging mysticism and things that are just, you can't understand, which I sort of love.
Absolutely. I feel like that dovetails wonderfully into my last question, which is just that it is such an odd, scary experience to read about people feeling nervous in 1939 in Brussels, to be doing that in 2025 in America. And we're recording this at the beginning of February, and I can only guess how we'll be feeling when we listen to this in mid-March, this podcast. So, like, these characters are very well aware of encroaching Nazism, but they are very much unaware of how bad things might get, and how bad they do get, both in the course of the novel and then what we as readers who live in history know, what will have happened to these characters. And yet, oddly, weirdly, beautifully, I still found so much comfort and hope and joy in reading this novel. And so I'm wondering, let's leave off with, what do you want your readers to take away from 33 Place Brugmann? And why is it a novel that is important? Like, why do we desperately need to be reading this in March of 2025?
Wow. So I think it's critical to understand what happened in the 20th century as it so profoundly shapes our own
Hmm.
and helps us understand this moment. At the beginning of the novel, it's true, there's a head in the sand reluctance among some of the characters, not all, to
Hmm.
acknowledge how bad things are or might become. And I think all of us have this capacity for wishful thinking. It's American exceptionalism, right? The
Hmm.
idea that it can't happen here. It's a terrible thing when that illusion is broken, and it so often is broken. Um, so my characters find themselves in exactly that circumstance, what Dickens would call, the worst of times. Um,
Sure.
and yet each of them struggles and stumbles towards some version of humanity, imperfectly, not always surviving. Some come to a deeper understanding of why ideas and art matter,
Hmm.
what it is about humanity that art embodies.
Hmm.
I think the novel is at times, I acknowledge, unsparing with this recognition of how cruel the world can be and how hard won those truths are. still this hope that art and communication are at the core of our common humanity. Francois's conviction that we must keep talking.
Mhm.
These are, to me, very useful takeaways for our current moment. So.
Absolutely. Okay, that's a wonderful place to end. Thank you so much for answering these questions and for spending some time with us. And thank you for writing this book. I'm so excited for it to be out in the world. I think people are going to find so much in its pages.
Well, thank you for reading it, and this was just my pleasure.
Thank you for listening to Booked, the bookstore education podcast brought to you by the American Booksellers Association. Don't forget to subscribe to the show on your favorite podcast app. Additional educational resources can always be found on the ABA website at www.bookweb.org. Happy reading!